Okay, yeah, let's just start then. So basically, the way I basically see the situation is that we have the merge upcoming, and then afterwards I personally see us going down 4 different paths. We just basically have to choose which of the 4 we want to go down. The first one would just be no change, so we don't include any EIP into the merge that would alter the base fee calculation, and then we probably do something in Shanghai, but we have more time to actually properly work on something. The second alternative that I see is what I kind of like to maybe call Mikhail's proposal, although as Mikhail was pointing out, he was only kind of like bringing it up as like a thought experiment, but I actually think it's worth thinking through because it has interesting trade-offs as well. That is basically like basically acting as if there would have been some like empty blocks in the missed slots doing the base fee calculation. So you don't actually insert empty blocks with all the complexity that would entail, but just doing the calculation, you just act as if there would have been empty slots. So basically the base fee goes down even before the block you're building now, as if there would have been empty blocks in between, which has interesting trade-offs. And then the other 2 alternatives would be the ones like the one that kind of like the EIP proposes. So I would call that time-aware base fee calculation, and then the 4th one I would say time-aware plus this buffer, which would make the time-aware much more smooth. Right? Is it generally, like, just briefly before we then dive into like the pros and cons and dive into the individual ones, like are there any ones, I don't know, people have thought about over the weekend or something, any other alternatives that people have come up with that they would want to include in this list of possible options?
Are we specifically focusing on things that would be reasonable for the merge?
Yes. So that will be the threshold. Basically, what can we because this is for things we can do during the merge.
Okay, I don't have anything else then.
Did
anything else? That's it.
Something has to be done for the merge. Is that like the consensus mainly?
No. That's why I would say like the first option would be do nothing and then do something during Shanghai. So unless you kind of want to propose to just kick do nothing out of the list of considerations, but I do think that do nothing is definitely up there as things to do.
I feel like we should decide for certain whether we want to do something before we start to restricting this space of solutions.
Right, but I think it kind of makes sense to know what we could do. Because, okay, I mean, I guess the first question is, would we want to do something, right? Like, because if we already say that we don't want to do anything, even if we have good options, then we don't even have to look more into the options. If we say we want to do something, we can always like fall back to doing nothing if it turns out that all the options we have are not nice enough or something. So I guess
right, so as a proxy for that, you could ask yourself, if we just had to change a constant, would we do it? Like a constant change is basically the simplest change we can possibly have. And so if we're willing to do a constant change, or if we're unwilling to do a constant change, then we're definitely unwilling to do any other solution.
Right. So Marius is saying, I think he's on the train, so it's like spotty connection, probably not good enough for voice, but he's saying that he's not a fan of doing anything. Because it's like it introduces extra complexity, it's a change, and he's not convinced that there's a need for it.
As I understand it, the problem we're trying to solve is that as the number of if not all blocks get proposed, each block that doesn't get proposed just takes away 1 block's worth of capacity from the system, because the way the difficulty base fee adjustment algorithm works. Is there any other problem we are trying to fix, or is it just that one?
I think it's mainly, so there's this one additional small one that like after missed slot, there's this small spike of the base fee before it then settles back at like basically the same level. So this is like, but this is the small one. So basically just it's a little bit unsmooth, unfortunately. UX-wise, that's not ideal, but I think that the main ones are indeed missed throughput, and then the true consequence of this one, the kind of the how it incentivizes, it potentially incentivizes DOS attacks for individual validators, and two, that it can make the whole system react even worse unless in times of consensus issues. And I guess the third one of just in general that we don't like reduced throughput, although that we can just correct by increasing the gas limit. So say it's mainly the two. It's mainly the DOS incentive and the decreased robustness in the face of consensus issues.
I'm curious, yeah, Marius, like, I guess if you can speak why you feel like these are not like big enough. Okay.
So I'm currently in the train station, so I
Yeah.
can speak a bit maybe. I don't know. I wouldn't say that robustness actually decreases, because that, like, in the case of a DOS, the chain would keep on going.
The chain would
And-
keep going, but the throughput would be reduced.
Yeah, but isn't that something that we actually want in the case of an attack?
It's a different
Depends
kind
on
of
the class
DOS.
of-
It's not a transactional DOS. It's a DOS against the producer,
Oh,
which is a different
yeah.
class than we have today, basically.
Oh,
Like, I'm not convinced that the DOS attack is like actually really dealt with by that change, because the most promising time to do a DOS attack is if you notice that there is a massive MEV opportunity and that you are the next but one block proposer. You are very strongly incentivized to DOS the next proposer, and then you can exploit the MEV opportunity.
Yeah, but
And I
that's
think-
infeasible. Like that's, I mean, like we talked about it on all codevs. Basically, that reduces the attacker set from everyone who potentially could benefit from Ethereum having great performance to only the immediately next block proposer. And like, because a DOS, like something like this DOS attack is not something you can just spin up willy-nilly, where like when you see something like it, you'd have to prepare it for like very thoroughly in advance. You'd have to map out the whole network and de-anonymize the individual validators. All for the off chance that like once a month you produce a block and like you have this MEV opportunity immediately in front of you. So basically, like, I just don't think that we have to worry at all about individual validators tossing each other.
and
I think it's
Ansgar,
way more frequently than once a month.
Ansgar,
I think you could.
and it doesn't have to be MEV opportunity. You can just, if the mechanism allows you to create a bigger block, the second block after a missed block, you can do this every time. You will just do this every time. Whenever you propose a block, you will DOS the guy before you.
Right. So this is basically an incentive. Yeah, that's true. That would be an incentive that exists under all different scenarios. So like, if we do no change at all, then there's already an incentive, because if you just DOS the person in front of you, their transactions just pass through to you. If but any of the proposed adjustments kind of like leave that situation as is. Even the synthetic empty blocks as a solution would even make it worse, because you could extract more value. Like as a block proposer for the immediately following block, you can extract more even from base fees. I mean even more from tips. So like yeah. So all of these proposals, none of these proposals would address that particular issue.
But the thing is that these proposals do kind of address the issue of people who are not in ecosystem who are trying to attack Ethereum. Like, most of the ways people benefit of DOSing people in these scenarios are if you are actually a staker and you're actually producing blocks. Well, this is kind of trying to avoid is the scenario where you are just an outside participant of the network. You're just watching and you just want to see Ethereum degrade.
Right, similar to the Shanghai attacks. Just with a different mechanism. Here you're not DOSing by creating like especially hostile blocks or anything. You try and kick down individual validators. So I do think, even though basically there's another set of incentivized parties, meaning the validators themselves, I still think that like getting rid of this other set of potential incentivized attackers would be helpful. As Matt was saying. But of course, I don't know. I think it's hard to grasp, right? It would be like a extra consensus change for like a very hard to assess risk, right? It could just be that this is completely theoretical and no one will ever bother trying to DOS validators. Or it could also be that like people DOSing validators would just do it in order to cause chaos, and they would even do it if it doesn't hurt the throughput of the chain. It's hard to assess like how much reducing the input on throughput would alter the incentives, if they even are there at all.
I agree. I think the incentive is already there. There's already a big incentive to just DOS the validators, and you're not really fixing that with anything, because if you propose a mechanism that increases the block size for the next block or whatever, then you've just increased the incentive to also DOS the next guy.
Right, but of course, I mean, this all is under the assumption that like even a motivated and kind of not skillful attacker is unable to DOS like the majority of validators, right? Because if they're able to do that, then like, I mean, we should just not do proof like the merge at all. So like all of this is based on the assumption that like even a motivated attacker can only occasionally DOS a validator successfully. And so if that is the case, then basically with making sure that like the average throughput remains the same, like for that you could basically kick down 5%, 10% of validators, and you would have no impact on the throughput. So I do think that it helps there. The question is, does it matter enough? Like, is it really about throughput when people attack? I mean, I think it's about throughput, but like, would they even bother if they can only reduce the throughput by 5 or 10%, right? Because if we have sustained attacks and they DOS 10% of validators, we can also just manually increase the gas limit by 10% to offset this. And so I think the more important part of the DOS attacks against validators is probably just to, I don't know, make validators unhappy and cause internal conflict on Ethereum, I guess.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I'm wondering what would be incentives for external parties to DOS validators, and I'm just not that convinced that reducing throughput is all that valuable for an attacker, because it only reduces throughput by a couple %, and we can correct that manually anyway with a gas limit. So it's still nice if it was unable to even do this couple % effect, but like I just don't think attackers would be motivated by this couple % in the first place. I think it's more likely that they're just motivated by trying to generally degrade and just like, yeah, cause conflict within Ethereum. And if I, as a hobby validator, regularly have my block proposals prevented by some DOS attack, but Coinbase staking, because they have a beefy firewall, they can just chug along and produce blocks, then I might be really annoyed and I might stop staking, and that decreases the decentralization. So I think that's like the implication, like the motivations for DOSing validators are probably more of this long-term making staking worse kind of motivation. I mean, I don't know. I'm personally like my motivation for this EIP was definitely more on the keeping throughput up during times of consensus issues, because during the interop event we talked a whole lot about scenarios where all the prison nodes go offline, or all the GET nodes go offline, or all the Lighthouse nodes go offline, and I personally very much expect this to happen within the first year after the merge, at least one event where one of the client combinations can't keep up with the network, and that would kick a significant amount of validators offline. And I personally really want the chain to just not lose any throughput during that time. That is my main motivation. But like
I
this
guess,
DOS attack came up, and so I also brought it up in the EIP.
yeah, I guess if the concern is with one specific combo, that seems less of a problem because you can swap out, like if it's, I don't know, like Prism and Besu, right? Like you can swap out Besu for Geth or something like that. That seems like an easier fix than like if it's an issue with like Prism itself, right? So and I don't know, it seems like the odds of an issue with just a single client are kind of lower, just given that like we've had the beacon chain live for a year, we've had mainnet live for 5 years, and you know they both work and haven't had these kind of major issues, and recovering from like a compatibility issues, yeah.
Well,
And yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that like I don't follow the beacon chain as much as I follow the execution chain, but like on ETH1, I mean we had 2 consensus issues over the last 2 years, right? Which was like only minor impact, but one of them kicked all the open Ethereum nodes of the network for a while, and so these things do happen. And I think there was something on the beacon chain as well, where like one client for a while couldn't keep up or something. I'm not quite sure, but
okay, right, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, but I mean these things do happen.
Yeah, fair enough.
And the nice thing right now in Ethereum, and we're really about to lose this, is that like in proof of work, I mean, for one, miners are relatively centralized, for better or worse, and so like they are relatively good at reacting quickly if they're on the wrong chain or something. But also with the difficulty adjustments, we have this really quick self-healing property. We're sure we have a little bit of reduced throughput for a short amount of time, but then we usually back up and running. And given that almost all miners run the same MEV Geth anyway, they kind of like usually like it's rare that like a small like a 20% portion or so splits off. So it's really
Right.
like usually just all works, and in proof of stake this will just no longer be the case. It's much more likely that we have like a 20% drop off or like a 30% drop off, and there's no no self-healing on any reasonable timeline. It's basically just stays this way, and it just basically like from 1 second to another, we just have sustained 30% throughput loss on the chain. I think that's really unfortunate.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess if this does happen, we want to be in a spot where like we're also not making things worse with 1559, right? Like we're actually, keeping like, and well, actually, even with your proposal though, if this happens and we're losing like 30%, the best we can get because of like the slack factor in the blocks is like twice as, I guess, yeah, that can bring us all the way up to like, say we lost 50% and we'd have like 200% full blocks every other block. Okay. Yeah, so your proposal would help.
I mean, yeah, I mean, if you remember this kind of this slope.
Yeah, the graph,
like,
yeah.
Right, because if we do the simplest thing where we don't have a buffer or anything, we would only recover like parts of the lost throughput. That's why I really think something like persistent buffer would be nice, because then you'd actually could lose all the way up to 50% without any throughput losses, or even considering the Mikhail proposal of the synthetic empty blocks. The nice thing of the synthetic empty block is that they also completely avoid throughput losses all the way up to 50% offline. The disadvantage is that the synthetic empty blocks have other undesirable side effects that I think the time aware proposal does not. But we can dive into them. But so there are ways of trying to really not lose any throughput all the way up to 50% offline for proposals.
And if I understand, like, is Marius still here? Yeah, I'm not sure if you can answer if you're in the train, but like, is the main concern like just that we're adding additional complexity, that we're like changing this thing which already kind of works? Yeah, I guess I'm curious, like, what's the, what's the
Yeah, so I have
main concern with implementing this?
I have multiple concerns. We're changing something that kind of works already, and that has been like proven to work. So there was like a lot of work done in getting this mechanism to where it is, from Barnaby and others, I think. And I don't know. I really don't like changing this thing ad hoc. And yeah, it also just introduces another change into the merge, and the merge is going to be the like the most insecure point in Ethereum history. The point where like most thing can go wrong ever, and I would like to have as little changes as possible there.
I don't actually think that's unreasonable. I think it's definitely something where we could step back and talk about, like, yes, even if, say, under a consensus issue, which I think it's not unrealistic that we'll have one hopefully minor consensus issue between the merge and Shanghai. But if we say we'll have some version of this in Shanghai, and we have more time to work on the best version of the proposal and really properly analyze all the edge cases, say, then it's really only about about the time between the merge and Shanghai. And like, I mean, we always have some delays on mainnets. I assume that the time won't be like 3 or 4 months. I assume it's more likely to be like 6 to 8 months between the merge and Shanghai. But even that is like a limited amount of time. And during that time, it's not like it's a huge vulnerability. It's like it is basically a non-insignificant degradation of service during consensus issue, but we can react by increasing the gas limit, right? So basically while there's no self-healing abilities, if we react relatively quickly and increase the gas limit, it kind of counters the throughput loss as well. Of course, it's something which would probably take a couple of hours, but at least it's not like we have to live with a couple of weeks of reduced throughput. And if we really think that the DOS attacks are not that severe, and again, that's just not my area of expertise too much, and then I think Marius's proposal of saying, like, let's do this properly and only do it in Shanghai and keep the merge minimal, I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea. I don't know. To me, it seems to be kind of like in the little bit, right at the border of, like, it's small enough that it might be good to still do it now, but it also, like, maybe not. Maybe we should wait.
Can I also point out that, like, there's enough like talk and ideas about how the fee market works that like definitely aren't appropriate to do at the merge, but it's reasonably likely that regardless of whether we do this change, that we're likely to do something more substantial in Shanghai anyway.
I would agree with you if there weren't already like 40,000 things that we're saying are going to be in Shanghai. So I like, my personal read right now is like something like, I don't know, say like the AMM fee market like proposal. Like, I see that very unlikely in Shanghai, just because we have a bunch of EIPs that are like already much more specced out and that have been waiting, for like probably close to a year already. So more realistically, like, maybe something small like this gets done in Shanghai because it's small and like it's easy to articulate the value and whatnot. But I think, like, if we need to do withdrawals in Shanghai, if we have like 4 or 5 EVM related EIPs that we want to all do or do a subset of, if we have to do like, a small fix with 1559, that seems reasonable. But I'm very skeptical that we do like introduce withdrawals plus like a massive change to how the fee market works. Like something,
yeah. No, also just for the record, I think, and that was part of the design choice of this EIP, that it's mostly orthogonal to all these other base fee changes, where, I mean, I initially went into this and also had some more interesting ideas around how to make the base fee calculation more elegant, but I abstained from putting any of that into this EIP, because basically the way to think about it, I think, is that, like, there's the signal for the base fee update that comes out of the fullness of the block. And right now we're debating how to modify the signal, right, by also taking the block time into account, potentially. But then there's the question of, once you have the signal, like of that the base fee should go up or down, like how do you calculate the new base fee? Like, do you do this 1/8 rule that we have right now? Do you do some maybe additive rule instead? Do you do some exponential rule instead? Do you do like an AMM rule instead? But all of this is basically just taking the existing signal, like that tells you whether you should go up or down and how much. Basically, there's like a strength of how much you should go up and down, and then just calculating the actual new base fee out of it. And so basically, like all of these other proposals are kind of like on the how to calculate side, whereas this is on the what should the signal be to look at side. And so I think it's mostly orthogonal. So it's not something where like we change it now and then we probably completely change it again in Shanghai. I think it would be mostly orthogonal.
Right, and I think, yeah, like Barnaby is also looking right now at ways that we could improve this signal. So like, yeah, I suspect it's possible that that's another big thing that gets discussed for, I'm not sure if we could put it in Shanghai, but either Shanghai or the one after.
Right.
So it
So then
seems like, oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, it seems like people are leaning towards doing nothing.
it seems that way. I mean, also it seems, at least to me, like no one is. So just briefly recap, like how concerned are we about the external DOS? Like again, external meaning like we ignore for a second the validators DOSing each other. Like how concerned are we about external DOS? How concerned are we about throughput reductions during consensus issues? It sounded like people are barely concerned at all about external DOS attacks on validators, and only a little bit concerned about the throughput loss as well. Is that a good assessment?
I am more concerned about the throughput loss than the external DOS attack on the time horizon that we're discussing. Like post-merge, there is a sufficiently high chance there will be a outage of some kind on one of the consensus clients or one of the execution clients. And during that time, it would be nice if we didn't have throughput loss. I agree with Ansgar on that. And I think that the chances of that are fairly likely. Whereas the chance of some person who is not intimately familiar with Ethereum and working on it every day decides they want to show up and just stick around and be trolls to Ethereum, it seems unlikely they're going to do that, within 6 months after the merge, especially given the amount of work it would take to build such a thing.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable actually. And like, how would you say then, focusing on the throughput loss then, how okay would you be with a solution of just saying we just basically have to manually, well, I mean, okay, first question with the gas limit, right? Because the way to manually react at least would be by pushing up the gas limit. We do not expect to have the EIP match your EIP that removes this ability from the individual stakers and gives it into consensus control. I don't think we want this included. Is that right?
There's no plans to include it before Shanghai.
Okay, so then during this time period, we would still have the gas limit control in the hands of the stakers. And so what we can always do is like, if we see a 30% throughput loss because some client combination or combinations making up 30% of proposals go offline, we could just basically tell people to manually push the gas limit up 30%. Of course, the disadvantage is twofold. One, it takes a while. I guess it takes at least several hours, probably more like a day or so before this information reaches enough stakers that we can actually move the gas limit. And then also secondly, once the participants come back online, there's a risk that because there's like some amount of people who want a higher gas limit anyway, that the gas limit is just sticky at the higher value and doesn't come back down. And then we have the problems of like a too high throughput.
And then you can hard fork the limit in the next upgrade in a contentious way. But yeah, that is
Right.
but I think you're right that that's a risk, right? Like we raise the gas limit 30% and it gets stuck there, and like it becomes contentious to bring it back down.
Right. I mean, this doesn't sound like too bad, right? I mean, all of this is
Yeah,
only in the
yeah.
scenario that we do have an issue, which is not like
Yeah.
it's not guaranteed to happen. And I mean, like, how well are people attuned? Because I always hear these kind of things that like with the difficulty bomb, even a few percent of slower blocks would be terrible for DeFi or something. I never believed this. I always feel like that's hard. But how bad would it? Do we have like a good feeling for like how bad it would be for the chain to just have like a day of 30% reduced throughput or something? Is it like just like an inconvenience, or is it like really bad? Or
to take the DeFi perspective, right? Like it's probably millions of dollars in like economic inefficiencies, right? Like and like you imagine just like ripple effects. It's like if Ethereum gets DOS, then like it slows down, then like it starts people are upset about it, and it starts being like negative coverage and whatnot. Like I think it will be a bad thing, but it'll be a bad thing kind of because Ethereum is getting DOSed.
Well, no, I mean this this would be in the case of like consensus issue, but yeah, same thing. It would be like there would be narrative of like, yeah, we have like a specific issue with the client or something, and like
and I think what's bad with the what's bad with the narrative in a way is like if you have a narrative and like say that the price starts going down, then that actually creates demand for on-chain activity because everybody is then trying to get like their their collateralized positions not liquidated, so everybody wants to use the chain at the same time. But then we already have less throughput, so it makes it's just like a compounding bad problem. But like
right. And so I mean, like what it would feel like is of course just like higher base fee, right? Because then at that level we would still and so
and also to be fair, like this is not like the only case in which these things can happen, and applications I think are like starting to work to improve like their resiliency towards that. So like there was obviously like the Black Tuesday thing or Thursday, like when COVID hit and a bunch of people got liquidated, and Maker had a bunch of issues. And I think applications are starting to do things like having longer time windows to put collateral and stuff like that. So like this an issue on mainnet is not the only case where like the performance can be degraded for some of these applications. If like there's a massive drop in price for something external to the chain, like everybody's going to want to rush and do stuff. So so these applications kind of need to be robust to that as well. And it's obviously not a good thing, and you don't want to like have it happen, but I don't think the case we're describing is like beyond the sort of scope of negative events that like robust applications have to think about.
And I mean, especially because if we're saying that because it would just basically mean a higher base fee, and so I don't know, say 2x the base fee would result in like a 30% reduced demand or something. I don't know, something like that seems realistic. And so I mean, we already have inter-week variability of base fees of more than 50%, right? Like it's not wouldn't be super unheard of if we have like twice as high base fee for a week.
Right.
We already have that.
And I think the concern is not as much the twice as much base fee for a week, but it's like the 10 to 100x as much base fee for 30 to 300 minutes, right? Like if there's like this hours long period of time where everybody is trying to use the chain ASAP, that prices a lot of people out, obviously. And then if some actions need to be taken within that period, and for some reason you can't get in, and the reason being like you're not bidding high enough, that can be kind of really negative. But I don't think a week of twice as high the base fee is like, I mean, it's bad, but it's not like catastrophic in any use case.
So the thing to keep in mind is that for the last, 2 years, there have been some non-trivial percentage of users that would like to use Ethereum that cannot. That percentage will go up if we have 30% of empty blocks. But fundamentally, there will still be a class who can use Ethereum and a class who cannot. And that fundamental aspect won't change, just the size of each pool will change a little bit.
Right, but we are talking about during times of unusual, basically shortly after a sharp drop of block proposals. So for a couple of days after consensus issue. It's not like a persistent situation.
Yes. So I mean, I think the argument you're making, if I understand correctly, is basically that the sudden change can be unexpected. And so while users, 1 minute they're able to participate and use Ethereum, and then the next minute they're not, and they can't for a day. And that's a little out of the ordinary, but even that isn't unheard of. We've seen that behavior just due to something hits the news or some new product comes out or whatever, and you see, the set of users that can't afford to use Ethereum just went up by huge margin. And one could argue that is functionally the same. So whether we have an increase in supply, a decrease in supply or an increase in demand, they're functionally the same overall. And so we have seen times where the increase in demand suddenly appeared out of nowhere and lasted for an extended period of time. And we have also seen, and so I don't think that's very different, in terms of broad economics, game theory, etc., than what we're talking about, which is that we have a sudden decrease in supply that lasts for a while.
Not only have we seen this, I mean, I don't know, I think there was in the news literally yesterday that we have the first full week of Ethereum being deflationary, which is because we had a week of really high base fees. And I don't know, right now the base fee is at 230, and we've had weeks where the base fee on average was at 30. So that's almost a 10x increase. And while it's not nice, kind of people are able to adapt and absorb this, and so a 2x difference in a situation, in a very exceptional situation that we don't expect to ever arise, but it could arise once during 6 months or so for 2-3 days. It really doesn't sound too bad putting it in those terms, to be honest. Right. So all of this does kind of point slightly towards us giving into Marius. But does anyone still feel strongly that we should do this now, for the merge already, and would want to try and bring us back on point us back towards that direction? Or is everyone either ambivalent or convinced that we shouldn't do it? Because I'm definitely ambivalent, and I'm fine with not doing it.
I'd just like to understand. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say I'm pretty empathetic to the concerns that 1559 has been vetted by many different people, and it's concerning to change these mechanics. But I think we still have enough time to have the proper people vet these things, and I find it pretty concerning that people who are not part of the Ethereum ecosystem can attack the network for a relatively cheap amount.
Just for the record, by the way, I do think that we've been hugely paranoid as an ecosystem about 1559, where we really treat it as this super black magic voodoo thing with super complicated impacts. And similarly, after the change, how every negative aspect thing that ever happened on Ethereum afterwards was blamed on 1559 without ever anyone bothering to try and even point out how a plausible mechanism could have worked. Oh yeah, basically went up. This has to be 1559's fault and everything. And in reality, I really think that 1559 is quite a simple mechanism, and it's not all that hard to reason these things through. But I mean, again, this is outside of this discussion. It's more like a for the record thing. So Matt, what you're saying though is that you're concerned about the external DOS issue, and like for that reason, you would still prefer us to do something for the merge
like-
already to disincentivize this further.
What I'm hearing is that the thing that people are afraid of is that we are going to do something that's going to break 1559 or increase the surface area of the merge. And I think that there's still time to have people like Barnaby, people like Tim Roughguard review a change to 1559. And I think that that's going to make the network safer. And I think that we should try to make it happen.
So I'm not worried about that part. Like I think the changes proposed are pretty tiny, and they'd be pretty easy to review. And like I said, we can get them reviewed in time.
Then what is the main concern for not doing things? Because my understanding was that it had to do with
that the merge. It is another change that is just one more thing that can have a consensus failure or bug. And so when you're going through and dealing with consensus failure after consensus failure after consensus failure, well, we're like leading up to the merge and working on it and all this stuff because it's really complicated. Adding one more thing to that just is yet another thing that can fail and delay and cause distractions, stuff like that. And so I think the idea is just literally anything would meet that bar of it's a change.
Yeah.
Things will change, tests will break, stuff is going to go wrong because that's what happens when you change things. I guess the way the world works, when you change things, things break.
Is there value in maybe like trying to do kind of the review of this in parallel to the merge work, and we can kind of see, because like if we do nothing now, obviously we're not going to do this for the merge, right? Maybe it's valuable to take Ansgar's proposal, have it reviewed by Barnaby and potentially Tim Roughgarden if he still has the bandwidth for this stuff. And in parallel, obviously the client teams are going to be working on the merge. And once we have this kind of thoroughly reviewed, we can see, is this something we want to add, like, based on how complex the client code is.
What's the timeline here?
So I would rather spend Barnaby and Tim Roughgarden's, I would rather spend their time on something more long-term personally. Like, unless there's a good chance this will actually go in the merge, I'd rather them spend that same time like working on the AMM fee market, for example, or changing it so we do rate-based throughput instead of block-based throughput. Like, those are changes I think are way more valuable, but not definitely out of scope for the merge. And I'd rather, if we're going to throw brains at this class of problems, particularly brains that could be doing something else in this class, I would rather do other things in this class.
I think. Oh yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I was just gonna say, I generally prefer to like softly accept things and then, based on the like output of the research or development, remove them rather than like quote unquote work on parallel, because I feel like it's just a stronger signal that this is something that might happen. It's not really that relevant. But I also don't understand Marius's point that there needs to be a change to the transaction envelope. I think this is only a change in the state transition and the verification logic of 1559.
I saying in the early transaction processing period. So like before you're in the EVM, before you're like we have to do
on the individual transaction level, isn't it on the block validation level?
I think his point. I think his point is just that like this particular area of code where this change would live is an area of code that will not be touched otherwise by the merge. And so now there's like a whole section of code that was
it will be touched by
previously
the merge
going untouched
because the consensus module is being modified. I mean, there's a fully new consensus module now, and so
I guess
that piece of code is all changing.
Yeah, so I guess it depends on how your specific client. I think that's just that's dependent on the architecture of the specific client. I can imagine a client design where the consensus module is pluggable, and I would assume most clients are like that because they all have multiple consensus engines already. In which case, it's just like you instantiate a different class or something very early on. Otherwise, no code is touched. Like instantiate A instead of B.
But don't we already change some of
Again,
the
that's just
block header validation logic?
No,
Like, I don't know, similar to how
we
we enforce difficulty has to be 1, right? Like this is a change in the header validation inside the execution client. No?
Is that validation occurring in the execution engine, not the consensus? I know there's been, because the consensus client is doing some block validation themselves, I believe.
Yeah, but the execution client still is verifying different portions of the header.
Okay. And so it will validate the difficulty is in fact 0 or sorry, non-difficult. So difficulty they can't validate because it's random. So, but you're right. We need to remove the difficulty check at least. So you're right. There will be a change in the block validation because we have to remove the difficulty check at the very least.
Right, and there will be also a change in the block validation because we need to remove rewards. We need to deprecate some fields, right? So these are also changes. And my main question here is, what kind of work should we do before we can accept this EIP? I mean, do we need to do some analysis? I guess yes. Do we need to, and what kind of like engineering work, like testing, observing this new behavior in the test net, artificially making missed slots and see how it progress, or what else could be in this list?
Yeah, I think that kind of depends. Oh, I mean, not depends, but maybe it's related to the general question of timeline here, right? Like, what is, because I think the goal was to have the spec freeze more or less for the merge by the end of October. We have like 1st of November now. Is it 1st? Yes, 1st. So I mean, I guess spec freeze in general is kind of like a weak spec freeze where there might still be changes afterwards, and this I guess could come in later. But what's the timeline? By what time would we have to make a final call on this being part or not being part of the merge?
In 11 minutes.
That's a good question, but this freeze for the end of October that we are working currently at is not the last one. So this is to initiate the next wave of engineering efforts around the merge. It's not like the the final set of things that will go into the merge. So and for like the last for when the last like spec freeze should be expected, it's like a really difficult question. Depends on what we'll see in November.
Yeah, but I do think we probably don't want any new features. Like this seems like it's maybe the last feature that we want in the merge, right? Like obviously the spec freeze, like if we find bugs and whatnot, we need to change the specs, but like the general mechanism, I don't think it's going to change. And you know, the block header and whatnot is not going to change, but this seems like it's maybe the last feature change we want to bring into the merge. And that being said, it's like then it becomes a trade-off. Like if we really want this, then obviously we'll add it in. I think we do need, if we wanted to get this done, we should start researching and testing things kind of now, at least from like an EIP level, and expect that like once clients have implemented this latest spec freeze, which I don't know, say it takes like a month, then this would be like the next thing they implement. So either very late this year or early next year. But I suspect, and I guess for the people here, like what this means is like we probably need to get this into a spot where it's like spec frozen for the EIP before kind of the holidays.
Right. And then what I'm just wondering is, because I'm personally kind of optimistic that kind of working on this in parallel, like we will probably kind of get to some finalized version of the EIP that everyone thinks is the best thing we can do for the merge, and that it's incentive compatible with 1559 and everything. But the question then is, at that point, we would come back to say all quarters or something, and discuss this again. And then I feel like we kind of fall back to the same discussion we had here over the last 45 minutes of like, but do we really need this in there? And if the answer then will be no, the question is why even put all the effort in, right? Like, is there a reasonable chance that people will actually want to include it if it is ready in time, and if the arguments don't change to what we discussed here today, is basically my question. Because I mean, I would be more than happy to just continue working on this and working with Barnaby and whatever, and like making sure it is ready in some form, but all of this only makes sense if there's a reasonable chance people then want it in, and I'm just not sure.
Right. I'm not sure what's the best way to get to that conclusion without basically having this conversation again in 2 weeks. I do wonder, I guess, maybe it's worth spending like a bit more time, like spending like say until the next Awkward Devs to like get, I don't think we can get like Tim Roughgarden in the next 2 weeks to like comment on this. I mean, we can try shooting him an email, but we can probably get Barnaby. I guess there's not a lot of people from the E2 side here as well, and like getting also kind of their input just to see like, if like with regards to how just like the spec works and whatnot, the benefits of this. Yeah, I don't know. It feels like maybe there's value in spending like the next 2 weeks trying to get more eyes on this and more feedback, and making kind of a call on our core devs like in 2 weeks, whether this is something we want to like weekly include potentially.
I don't think there's significant pushback on the implementation itself. I think the pushback is on just the general premise of should we change anything, and or is the threat significant enough that we need to care? Like, even if we had 100% buy-in from Barnaby and Tim Roughgarden, and they were like, yeah, this is amazing, will be great, this will fix all of our problems, I don't think that would change the outcome in any way. And so I'm hesitant to devote resources to getting that if it's not going to actually impact the outcome.
Okay. Go ahead, Maris.
For me, it would change the equation a bit. So for me, it's not only the I'm in the tunnel right now, so you can probably not hear me.
We can hear you perfectly well.
Oh, okay.
Actually,
nice. For me, it's probably it's a combination of both. It's a change in the algorithm that we don't really know if it like makes sense or if it even breaks something or whatever it does, and it's a change. So if like one of those would get resolved, I will probably, and there's sufficient buy-in from others to say, okay, this is actually an issue that we need to solve, then I wouldn't veto it anymore.
So one thing I'm talking with Danny also, he couldn't make the call, but he sent me a couple messages about this. One thing Danny Ryan kind of feels strongly about is right now there's no incentive in the E2 protocol there's no disincentive to not produce a block. So there's obviously an incentive to produce a block. You get the transaction fees, but you're not penalized in any way if you don't produce a block. So because of that, he would like to see something that takes into account missed proposals generally when calculating 1559, because it's like if you can, if people decide they want to agree by not proposing blocks, then you can make it easier for the next proposer, to like if the next proposer basically has to raise their base fee because of that, then you're just including less transactions, and that's not great. So I think it might be worth also talking with him in the next 2 weeks to see like is there a change that we can do, or does this current change basically help with the fact that we don't have a specific penalty for not producing blocks beyond the opportunity cost. And that might actually help. Yeah.
In a world of spherical cows, the opportunity cost is the penalty. It's equivalent to slashing. In the real world, I understand psychology is different around opportunity cost versus actual cost.
Right.
But like mathematically, which is what we usually try to model things on, even though it doesn't match reality, they are being slashed functionally.
Right. But if there's a way where like them not producing blocks is either neutral or positive for the next validator, you can kind of increase that. You're basically distributing that penalty in a way over two validators, right? As kind of a bonus to the other person, which is a nice property.
Right. Although, of course, I mean, it also has this dangerous drawback of this, at the same time, incentivizes people to try and orphan their ancestor blocks and
right,
kind of things.
Right. So I don't think, we probably can't solve this in 3 minutes, but I think given Marius' comments and like the general feeling, it's probably reasonable to spend a bit more time here and to maybe talk with like Danny and Barnaby and see if there's like a proposal that we come up with that's simple, kind of helps with the spec and is not like, obviously doesn't have like a huge engineering overhead. And then we can kind of make a soft call about that in like 2 weeks on Awkward Devs. Does that seem reasonable?
Is there anyone?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I thought that we were already under the assumption that we were doing the most minimal change that's possible. And so we were trying to determine, like, is that acceptable?
Right. And I guess
I was just understanding like what you're saying as like exploring if there are minimal changes and then trying to figure out if people
So
are.
I think it's less about the exploring, it's more about the understanding the proposed one better or something.
Yeah, okay. That and like if there's a tweak, I think we need like a generally minimal change. Like I don't think, and so anything that's like a overall like overhaul of the mechanism is kind of out of the question. Within the kind of universe of minimal changes, making sure that folks like I think Danny and Barnaby at the very least like are on board and think it's like generally a good idea. Or, if there's tweaks to the current proposal that don't add a ton of engineering complexity, but, make it like more robust, I think exploring those in the next 2 weeks makes sense.
So I haven't heard anyone here really indicate that they are strongly in favor of this. I think Matt is probably the most strongly in favor from just the sentiment analysis I've done in my head. Meanwhile, I think every single one of the core devs is going to push back on this. I suspect that unless we have someone who is really passionate about pushing this through, it is not going to go through just due to inertia alone. Like even if we do solve and address all the problems, I don't see it going through without a strong champion. So I guess the question I would like to answer before we walk away is anyone in this room passionate enough that they really want to fight and die on a hill in core dev calls? I think that's what's going to be required. And I mean, this isn't a hill that you guaranteed are going to die on, but there's a very good chance you'll die on. And so we need someone who's passionate enough that they're willing to take that risk.
I really don't want to die soon, to be honest. But
then you should not take this battle.
I'm willing to try and make a stronger case during all core devs, but yeah,
right. And then maybe
empathetic with the other side.
Right, and then maybe like last point here is that just like, because I'm super willing to spend a little bit more time over the next 2 weeks, a week and a half even. I don't think it's lost time anyway, because it helps understand 59 better. And so it would also, even if we don't go ahead with it for the merge, I think the kind of effort wouldn't be lost for then working on something similar for Shanghai. So I think it's reasonable, and then make a call if we want to move ahead or just stop on Awkward Devs. I think it would be helpful if maybe someone else, or maybe also myself, I don't know, could also spend some time during the next 2 weeks, kind of like working out a little bit clearer the specific reasons for why to do it, right? So basically like this DOS concern and the throughput reduction concern, just basically kind of like exploring this a bit further, and just so we have something of saying to clearly answer like why would we even want to do this. right? Because I do feel like we're kind of like a little bit like, yeah, maybe there are those concerns, maybe there aren't. Like, who is even the party that would be, right? Like these kind of things.
And are you guys, do the two of you care enough about this project to work on it in lieu of working on any of the other 1,000 projects you could work on Ethereum? I think that's the other question for the champions.
I'd be super happy to like spend some of my time over the next 2 weeks on it. If for no other reason than the vanity of having an EIP with my name on it, be a little bit more likely to move forward.
And that if your name is on an EIP, it will not go through. Like, that's just how the world works.
Yeah, you gotta add Mike as a co-author.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just for information, this needs to be merged yet. I see that it is approved, but still to be merged.
Yeah, Mike, I'm at what's going on with this? It's been ready since Friday. What's the delay?
Censorship.
Censorship. Yeah. Censorship is the real reason. The reason I'm going to tell you is that the bot is broken right now.
Yeah.
And
Micah broke the bot.
Yeah, just to censor your EIP.
Yeah, your transaction is not being censored. The bot is just broken. Yeah, that's
just. I guess just because we're coming up on time. I think the people it makes sense to speak for you to speak with Ansgar are at the very first I would say Barnaby and Danny. I think they can provide like good feedback. The problem with the DOS concerns, so unless like Maris is on the call here and I don't want to volunteer it, but like my feeling is like all of the client devs who are most qualified to speak about that are going to be working on the merge implementation in the next 2 weeks. So it might be hard to get kind of somebody. Yeah, if Maris wants to volunteer himself, he can. But like, yeah, I think that's kind of the main thing. Yeah, I don't know, maybe asking in Alcor devs or something if somebody on the client side is interested in kind of working on that.
Right, but isn't it because it's DOS of the actual of the proposer, right? So it's more on the,
sorry, yes, right.
Yeah, because it's a different DOS, right? So it's like it would be more on the consensus side of things.
Oh, yeah, the
that's
E2 devs, they just ship their hard forks. They have plenty of time on their head. So I think, yeah, yeah, I think then just asking in the consensus dev or like asking Danny, who's like the right person. So I think that still makes Danny and Barnaby the two first stops. And I'm sure Danny can find somebody on the consensus side who can look into that more.
Sounds good. And that's probably a good point to stop. Anything else anyone wanted to really bring up in the last seconds of this call? Okay, so then thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, just a couple of announcements before I let everyone go. There are 2 meetings coming up for that may be irrelevant for people here. One is the Ethereum execution layer of the state of Ethereum execution layer specification with Sam Wilson that is scheduled tomorrow. It's a peep and eat meeting, but it could be a very good discussion to know where the Ethereum execution layer specs are right now. And the meeting is scheduled at 18:30 UTC. The another meeting is the Merge Community Call 1 that is planned on November 5 at 1400 UTC. Thank you.
Thanks, Pooja, for organizing this. And I second the recommendation for the call tomorrow. Sam's walkthrough of the spec work. If you hate the yellow paper with if anything resembling the passion I do, then that would be the call for you to be on.
Send me a link. I do have great passion against the yellow paper.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining today. I'm gonna share the recording very soon, and I hope the next meeting is an all-core dev meeting. So let's see if there is any decision of having any further call related to this particular proposal, like the breakout room call. I'll be happy to schedule one. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, Pooja. And thanks everybody else.
Thank everyone. Bye.